Hi folks and welcome to my channel. Joining me today is Michael Kmet, an expert on the making of Star Trek the original series. For starters, thanks very much for taking part.
And thanks for having me.
Today I'd like to discuss the very first Star Trek episode to be filmed, which was entitled The Cage. What do we know about the production of this episode?
Well, it's interesting. I was just actually, before we had this call, I was reading through the earliest story outline that I have, which is from June of '64. And it's interesting to see what elements were there from the very beginning and which ones changed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the core crew is still there. There's number one. There's Captain Pike, although he's called Robert April in this version. There's the Enterprise. By the time they got to outline, it had been the Yorktown earlier, but then it was the Yorktown. But there's a lot of differences. The Telosians don't have a species name. They live on a planet called Sirius 4. They're supposed to be these giant crab monsters, which really brings to mind, a Roger Corman production. And I can see why they didn't execute it. The scope of the illusions is much bigger. Obviously, it was written before they had really thought about the budget. So there's that scene in the episode where he's reliving the landing mission and he's fighting, one giant creature. But in this outline, it's several giant ape men.
Oh, right.
There's one sequence that's in the outline, and I can totally understand why it was cut. And it has the aliens sort of demonstrating their power of illusion by putting the captain through a series of very quick illusions back to back to back. So there's one where he's in like Renaissance Venice. And it says in the outline that he looks out the balcony and sees the whole city. And I'm like, they're never going to do that on a television budget. And then it's followed, like right after that, it says it's an Earth setting 2049. So, 100 years in the future from when they were making it. And it's not even a quarter of a page in the outline. It's just a few sentences. And then he's off to some other illusion. But there are some of the illusions that stayed. When they punish the captain and he's in that sort of hellish fire and brimstone scene, that's in the very first outline. There is a scene with a green animal woman, although it's much different than how it would be in the final episode. The outline doesn't even say that Vina is one of them. She's just sort of there. I don't think Roddenberry had fully fleshed out that idea yet.
Cool. I wondered if they might have used like a matte painting of Venice to represent that scene.
I'm sure that they could have done that. The thing is, for a sequence that maybe on film would be, a minute, 2 minutes, it may have not been the most cost effective.
Yeah.
They didn't go to script until several months later, because when they did the deal with NBC, the deal was that Roddenberry would write 3 outlines, and then NBC would select the one that they wanted to go to script. And if they liked the script, then they would go and actually shoot the episode, which is what they ended up doing.
So do you know when the 2 other stories were they actually produced?
They were ultimately produced. One of them is called Mud's Woman, which was made as the episode of the same name. And the other one had a couple of working titles, which escape my memory at the moment, but eventually it was adapted into Return of the Archons in the first season.
Oh, right. Okay.
And Roddenberry had also noodled around with what became Charlie X, but he didn't really deliver a full-fledged outline in 1964. It wasn't until later when the series was bought.
Watching the episode recently, I wondered if there had been any consideration to actually showing the crash that Vina's disfigured in.
There isn't any of that in this outline. And I remember from some of the scripts, there's some added sequences. There's a sequence in the script. They never shot it. They cut it before filming. But it's basically a group of Pike's men who are being transferred off ship because they screwed up on a landing party. And it got his yeoman killed. That's why Colt is there as the replacement. But in terms of fleshing out Vina, I don't think they ever really scripted that stuff because they sort of wanted the backstory to, be a surprise, and you don't really find out, her exact circumstances until the very end of the story.
Yeah, I also wondered if like showing the crash would be like prohibitively expensive for them to portray.
Probably. I mean, if you look at the actual pilot, they weren't even able to execute that many visual effects of the actual Enterprise. They're very sparing, other than the great opening shot where they go into the bridge dome. There isn't that many effects that are very showy in terms of the space shots of the model. Reading this first outline, there's not a lot of talk about the technology yet at that point. Two exceptions, the things that were in the outline from the beginning are the laser guns, and they're called lasers. And then the telecommunicator is what the communicator is called in the outline. But he doesn't go into a lot of detail about what the bridge set looked like. I guess those ideas were discussed later. There is a document that I should look at that Roddenberry's assistant at that time, who later became Herb Solo's assistant, Maurice Chapnick, prepared, which has a lot of suggestions from department heads and various people after they'd made the two pilots, but before they were going into production on the series, and a lot of changes that they made. One of the things that they changed after the pilots is maybe even after the first pilot, the bridge is very metallic and reflective, and it's a very cool idea, and it is very evocative for Forbidden Planet, but it created all kinds of problems when they were filming because of reflections and glare. So that's why you get the slightly different look of the series. It was one of the most expensive pilots of all time at that point, though it may have not been the most expensive. There's some that say that the Alexander the Great pilot that Shatner was in was actually close to $1 million. But it's hard to know for sure reading accounts that are in the trades about budget, because everyone wanted to promote their production as the most expensive, the most elaborate. That may or may not have been true. It was still a very expensive pilot. $500,000 or $600,000 in 1964 money was a lot.
Do you know if there's any images of the filming which took place at Desilu 40 Acres for the interior of the Rigel 7 Fortress?
That's a good question. I, again, would defer to my friends Dave and Kurt, who wrote the book Star Trek Lost Scenes and run the Star Trek History website. They're really the pinnacle of image collectors in terms of behind-the-scenes imagery of the original series. I have seen images of the backlot from around that era. There's a great book that came out recently about the 40 Acres backlot. It was already somewhat in disrepair at that time, and it got worse, as the late 60s and early 70s progressed until it was eventually demolished.
Yeah, I watched a YouTube video the other day. It must have been fairly recently that there were two guys going around the area, and it's completely changed.
Yeah, no, it's about a mile from where I live, actually, and it's totally different.
Yeah.
They destroyed everything from the backlot, which is too bad. But there was a time of consolidation and selling off all the assets of all the major studios. So a lot of that happened. A lot of the Fox lot became Century City. There was big ranch areas that were sold off and became residential plots in Culver City.
I wondered how long the episode took to produce.
It started filming right around the Thanksgiving holiday. I forget the exact date, but it was November of 1964.
And do you know when it went on till?
They filmed it through December. I think it took about 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer. It was certainly the longest shoot of any episode of Star Trek. When they came back and made the second pilot, it went long too, but that was approximately a 10-day shoot. And typically they would shoot episodes of the series in 6 or 7 days.
Do you know why Jeffrey Hunter didn't return to portray Captain Pike, and why he was replaced with William Shatner portraying Captain Kirk?
Well, there's a few different stories about that. The most straightforward explanation is that he didn't want to do Star Trek anymore. There are some tales of his wife coming into a screening room with Herb Solo, Gene Roddenberry, and maybe Bob Justman was there, screened the pilot, and then she gave the decision that he wouldn't continue. According to the book Inside Star Trek, she said something about Jeffrey wanting to be a movie star, not work in television. I don't think that is 100% true, because he ended up doing a pilot within a year of Star Trek called Journey into Fear, which didn't end up going to series, but he still did the pilot and certainly had an option to go to series. The circumstances that were around Star Trek were somewhat unique, not completely, but certainly rare in that they made a second pilot episode, and there were no contingencies for that in any of the actors' contracts. They had an option on Jeffrey Hunter after he finished the pilot to do a first 13 of a season, but not to do a second pilot. So they had to get his sign on, and ultimately he or his wife or a mix of both of them decided not to continue with Star Trek. And so we got Shatner.
So had there been cases where there were second pilots for series before that?
Yes, there's a show called Tombstone Territory. They filmed a pilot. It was a syndicated show that Ziv made. I think it ended up airing on ABC, although I could be wrong about that. It actually lasted 3 seasons, and the second pilot ended up being repurposed as an episode during the first season. So it's very similar. There are other shows. There are a few second pilots that I've been able to find information about that never went to series. A program called I Remember Caviar. They made a second pilot. I think I'm getting the order here correctly, called All in the Family, which has no relation to the later All in the Family, although that series is also notable because it had 3 pilots before it finally got picked up. And there's some other examples. I wrote a blog post about this 5 or 6 years ago. I would have to look at those series again. I mean, there's the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was originally made as this pilot with Carl Reiner starring in the lead role, called Head of the Family. And they retooled it and shot a completely different script as the Dick Van Dyke Show, and that sold. And then eventually they reshot the script that they used as the original pilot as a later episode during the first season of that program. Waste not, want not.
Yeah, sure.
I mostly have a lot of documents, largely digital, some physical documents, but mostly it's just all on the computer.
Cool. Yeah, how do you manage to obtain the documentation from UCLA?
I was a graduate student there about 10 years ago.
Cool.
And I guess at that time I really had no idea what they had, but one of the archivists came in to our TV history class, and they had several different piles of documentation. And we're like, and we have the Star Trek papers, and they unfolded a set of blueprints that they have. And I thought, well, that's really neat. I wonder what else they have there. So I wrote a paper, which I later published. And it's okay. It's a very early example of my research. I think I've gotten a lot smarter about what I'm doing since then, but I'm still happy with the paper that I wrote. And I just started really looking at those documents, then finding other archives that are in the area. I mean, Los Angeles is super rich in terms of the resources that are available. Spent some time at the Academy Library, though obviously not in the past 8 or 9 months. All that stuff has been closed and will probably continue to be closed for at least another 6 months or a year, which is too bad, but understandable. Nobody wants to be in a tight reading room, breathing circulated air for hours. And then, collectors reach out to me and they send me some stuff. Dave and Kurt have been especially generous, sending me documents and things that they've been able to scan, some that they've been able to buy. I look at auction sites, but I don't really have the financial means to buy a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, some of it's really pretty pricey.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that you're on a website called Star Trek Fact Check?
Yeah, that was my blog for about 7 years, and now I'm working on a new project that's called Fact Trek with my research partner Maurice Molyneux.
Cool.
We've been putting together stuff. We just wrote a long deep dive into the making of Spectre of the Gun. It was published earlier today, I think. And we're really interested in sort of contextualizing the series in terms of its place in TV history. So we try to bring in information about other programs, other films and TV that was happening at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So that's been a fun project to work on.
Yeah.
Kept me sane, the past few months.
Yeah. I've been trying to watch Star Trek Discovery, but the 3rd season was definitely, but a bit different from the previous two, I would say.
I've seen the first 2 seasons. I haven't watched the latest season yet. It seems like a series where they've tried to reinvent it every year. Like they haven't really figured out what it is exactly.
But well, I think that was sort of like sown into the seeds of it from the very conception of it, because like Brian Fuller's original idea for Star Trek Discovery was that it was to be an anthology show, and the setting would change like regularly.
Yeah, some of the design decisions they've made, like the one that really gets me is the Klingon teeth that they haven't discovered, which makes it so hard for the actors to enunciate anything. And so it puts them in this weird position where they have to talk like very deliberately and slowly, and it takes a lot of the energy away from their performance. And it really looks like the mouthpieces that they have are affecting the performances in a way that I don't think anyone planned for or anticipated.
Like if you watch The Next Generation and stuff.
Oh yeah. I watched everything religiously through Enterprise, and I saw all the J.J. Abrams movies. And there's just so much of it now. There's so much other media to consume that I'm a little behind. I did watch Picard. I haven't seen Lower Decks yet.
So what did you think of Picard?
I had mixed feelings about it. I thought the premise was interesting. And I thought then it meandered for a little bit, and there was some strong material in the middle, especially when they reunited with Troy and Riker. I thought the character work in that episode was very strong. But it felt like a first draft almost. A lot of it was unpolished. I mean, Hugh's back. Okay, that's interesting. He's in 6 or 7 episodes, or 8 maybe, but he never really comes into his own as a character again, which is too bad. And I felt like the finale was particularly weak, with the terminal illness that manifests no symptoms until it kills your protagonist. A very dramatic moment. It was a bit of a tough dramatic note for me to swallow. But on the other hand, Patrick Stewart's still very good. He's very good. He knows that character, and he plays it very well.
So thanks very much for taking the time to discuss the developments of The Cage. It's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice chatting with you.